Good afternoon and welcome to the closing day of this year's Orkney Aviation Festival. If you wanted one image to sum up the history of Orkney's aviation service in the great pioneering days of the 1930s, it would arguably be a picture of the Havilland Dragon Rapide. The Rapide was regularly used in Orkney by Captain Ted Fresson's Highland Airways, which laid the foundations for so much of what we have today. It was possibly the most successful British-built short-haul commercial passenger aircraft to be produced during the 1930s. It was still used by BEA well into the 1950s. With us this afternoon to tell the story of the Rapide is aviation historian Iain Hutchison. History is his profession, and he works in the Centre for the History of Medicine at the University of Glasgow, where he is a historian of disability. He has long written on air transport history and indeed on the story of the Northern Air Services. Iain's books include The Story of Loganair, The Flight of the Starling, and Air Ambulance. He's co-author of BEA Line to the Highlands, and he's also the publisher of several aviation books, including Orkney by Air by Guy Warner, Loganair, a Scottish Survivor by Scott Greer, Island Pilot by Captain Alan Whitfield, and a classic, the second expanded edition of Captain Ted Fresson's Air Road to the Isles. He's going to tell us now of the plane that was put to such good use by Captain Fresson and others of that great generation of flyers. Iain, you are most welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Howie. Greetings to everyone. I'm quite impressed with that description there. This is a kind of long, broad look at the Rapide. The de Havilland TH-89 Rapide was in Scottish Airlines service, as Howie says, for over 2 decades, actually from 1934 right through till 1955. It made a substantial mark on Scottish air transport, but to place its long period of service from the independent operators of the interwar years through to British European Airways operation into context, I will begin by looking more widely at the early Scottish Airlines and air operators. From the early 1930s until nationalisation brought the formation of British European Airways, of BEA, in 1947, there were a variety of operators. Several of these began before the de Havilland Rapide became available, and these operators used a plethora of different aircraft types. Scottish Air Service providers during that time consisted of, and it's quite a list, Midland and Scottish Air Ferries, Aberdeen Airways, which later was renamed Allied Airways Ganderdour Limited, Highland Airways, Northern and Scottish Airways, Scottish Motor Traction, which was really first on the scene there, West of Scotland Air Services, and I'll explain this one later, but I've also got Irrawaddy Flotilla and Airways on my list. Then we have Scottish Airways, which was formed by the joining of Northern and Scottish Airways and Ted Fresson's Highland Airways. After the war, there was Scottish Airlines and, of course, British European Airways. John Sword's Midland and Scottish Air Ferries was effectively Scotland's first sustained scheduled air service provider when, in April 1933, it began services from Renfrew's Moor Park Aerodrome to Campbelltown, and these were soon extended to Islay. Sword quickly developed an impressive network that also served Belfast, Isle of Man, Blackpool, Liverpool, and indeed London. Unlike today, there was no effort to develop a fleet that benefited from commonality of one or two aircraft types. Aircraft were chosen by their deemed suitability for individual services, and there were at least 7 different types in his fleet. Sword was Western manager of the SMT bus company, which presented a conflict of interest that eventually saw him wind down his airline. SMT in their own right had an aviation division offering air taxi services. It had a fleet dominated by the de Havilland Fox-Moth, but which also included Avro Cadets and de Havilland Dragons, the DH-84. And here we see an image of SMT's Fox-Moth. Hot on the tail of John Sword's operation, Ted Fresson had set up Highland Airways at Longman Aerodrome in Inverness. And his aircraft, his first aircraft, was the General Aviation Monospar, which used to launch services in May 1933 to carry passengers, and a year later, mail for the post office to Kirkwall. The Monospar was a stopgap aircraft, and it was the DH-84 Dragon that was to be the initial linchpin to developing Highland Airways services. And these ran, say, from Inverness to Orkney. A separate operation was later established to link Aberdeen to the Northern Isles. The DH-84 Dragon played an invaluable role in making these early air services reliable. Rapide GACPO flew on demonstration to Highland Airways in October 1934. And there you can see it with one of the pilots, John Ray. The need for flaps for a lower landing run was identified, and these were in due course fitted. Rapide ACPN, which had been the second production aircraft and had previously been in service with Hillman's Airways, was leased in April 1936 to launch Highland Airways' new service from Aberdeen to Sunborough. And upon completion of the lease, Highland Airways acquired Rapide GADAJ, for those who are interested in these things, which served the airline for the next 10 years. A further Rapide, GAEWL, was delivered in 1937. When Midland and Scottish Airways ceased scheduled services from Renfrew at the end of 1934 and closed down early in 1935, the void that it left was filled by Northern and Scottish Airways, spearheaded by George Nicholson. Looking to Hebridean routes, Northern and Scottish included Campbelltown, Islay, Tiree, Barra, Askernish on South Uist, Benbecula and Solace on North Uist during the ensuing pre-war years. Northern and Scottish also favoured the DH-84 Dragon, but in addition it acquired 3-engine metal Spartan cruisers, which came in 2 variants. In the image on the left, you'll see one of the Spartan cruisers, and likewise flying over the University of Glasgow on the right. One of these, GACYK, came down on the Hill of Stake inland from Largs on the 14th of January 1938, where the fuselage lay until 1973, until it was airlifted out by helicopter, and after which it was displayed in the Museum of Flight at East Fortune. And this innocuous relic provides a poignant link with the past. You can still see the Northern and Scottish Airways lettering through the faded rust, if you look with a keen eye. By 1937, wider financial interests were at play in Scotland's fledgling airline operations, and these interests acquired Northern and Scottish Airways and Highland Airways to form Scottish Airways. However, Nicholson and Fresson continued to enjoy significant autonomy as they operated within their original spheres of interest. Nicholson out of Renfrew to the Hebrides, and Ted Fresson to the north from Inverness and Aberdeen. Air services were curtailed upon the declaration of World War II, but later resumed with Scottish Airways flying its aircraft under a consortium arrangement called the Associated Airways Joint Committee. This consortium was useful for creating a pool of resources such as scarce spare parts inventories for aircraft to keep them going. From 1934, there was another major player. When Eric Ganderdower opened an airfield at Dice, today's Aberdeen Airport, where he based several aviation-related companies, including Aberdeen Airways. In launching scheduled services, initially to Edinburgh and Glasgow, he too had to make do with an interim aircraft, the Short Scion, before he was able to start building a fleet of, again, DH-84 Dragons, and in due course, the de Havilland Rapides. From a wealthy family, Ganderdower did not have to sell out to outside interests like his rivals. If airline money became short, another family London property was simply put on the market, and upon sale, a cash injection was provided. So far, Stornoway hasn't been mentioned. When SMT ceased operating at the end of 1934, one of its pilots, Glyn Roberts, set up West of Scotland Air Services, for which he acquired Short Scion and Short Scion Senior aircraft. The Short Scion is on the left in the slide, and the four-engined Short Scion Senior on the right. Air taxi operations were his business, but he aspired to serve Stornoway with scheduled services using seaplanes, a notion that held much appeal to Stornoway Town Council, which balked at the expense of building an aerodrome. For this reason, when the likes of Fresson made occasional flights to Stornoway, in the absence of an airfield, his landings tended to be on the sands at Melbost. The plan for regular and reliable amphibious landings to serve Stornoway were accompanied by various challenges. Glyn Roberts' nickname apparently was Rocky, and that maybe focused attention on some of the hazards in proximity to Stornoway Harbour. Nonetheless, these seaplane deliberations meant that Stornoway prevaricated over building an aerodrome so that regular air services did not launch until 1939, and these were then with the land planes of Scottish Airways. On my list of early Scottish air operators, I've included Irrawaddy Flotilla and Airways. This is perhaps a bit of mischief on my part, this being an operation on the Irrawaddy River in Burma, with its office in Fair Street, Rangoon. As an outpost of empire, Burma was heavily under Scottish influence, not least in the massive inland shipping operation of the Irrawaddy Flotilla. Irrawaddy Flotilla and Airways was also a short-scion amphibious operator, and it had a small fleet of aircraft flying in tandem with the river steamers from 1934 till 1937. Again, you can see the Shorts aircraft, but also a Fox Moth up in the top left there. The airline closed down in 1937 after two of its short scions had experienced misadventures, and with the airline showing no signs of turning a profit. The head office of Irrawaddy Flotilla, its ships and aircraft, here you see an advert for Fair Street in Rangoon, but the head office was in Glasgow's St Vincent Street. A bit mischief there, say, on my part, but back home again. Lastly, Scottish Airlines, they were established at Prestwick in 1946, and they operated 9 different aircraft types. These included the Douglas DC-3, which you see again here, but also the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the Fokker 22, the Avro York, the Airspeed Oxford, the amphibious Supermarine Walrus, and the Scottish Aviation built Twin Pioneer. The airline looked to operating international services, but as nationalisation of air routes from 1947 stood in the way of this, it did so mainly through operating the likes of the Douglas DC-3s for other international airlines. These included Icelandair, Corbetta of Belgium, Luxembourg Airlines, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, and Hellenic Airlines of Greece. However, these arrangements could never expect to be a long-term plan, although Scottish Airlines' further airline activity was sustained for a time by participation in the 1948 Berlin airlift and in military contracts for trooping flights. A role for its Rapides was flying scheduled services out of Luxembourg for Luxembourg Airlines. The de Havilland DH-89 Rapide. The Rapide first flew on the 17th of April 1934 and was designed to carry between 6 to 8 passengers. In its early days, it was known as the Dragon 6 and the Dragon Rapide. In military service, it was known as the Dominie, although this name was also used in airline service in New Zealand, where some air services in the 1930s operated over terrain that was not so different from that in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. However, Rapide was the name that endured in most parts of the world, and a total of 727 Rapides were built. The earliest models of the Rapide were powered by 2 Gypsy 6 Series 2 engines. It was a tail dragger intended to carry up to 8 passengers. It had a wingspan of 48 feet. It had a maximum range of 578 miles, a maximum speed of 157 miles per hour, and a cruising speed of 132 miles per hour. In Scotland, the Rapide was operated by Northern and Scottish Airways, Highland Airways, Aberdeen Airways, which became Allied Airways Gander-Dower, Scottish Airways, Scottish Airlines, and British European Airways. The Rapide operated key Scottish routes during the Second World War, aircraft being painted in pseudo-military markings and having their passenger windows masked so that inquisitive passengers could not see military installations and shipping movements during their journeys. This image here shows the military markings applied to the aircraft. The windows are clear in this image. I'm not quite sure. The masking out of the windows maybe followed a little bit later from when this photograph was taken. As mentioned already, the Scottish Airways Group joined the Associated Airways Joint Committee, a wartime consortium of UK airlines that pooled resources to keep flying. But always of independent mind, Gander-Dower decided that his allied airways would not join this grouping, a decision that arguably proved not to be in his best interest. Some civil airlines were requisitioned during World War II. Among these were the 3-engine Spartan cruisers of Scottish Airways. In military service, the airframes of the cruisers were found to be seriously corroded as a consequence of their being used for beach operations during civil air transport service. And these were scrapped. You immediately think of Barra here, but Solace was also, it had an airstrip, but the beach was also used periodically. Scottish Airways fleet was therefore dominated by de Havilland Rapides. They were a familiar sight at island airfields. This image shows Captain David Barclay in the middle. And on this occasion, he's with an SNP by-election candidate for Argyll, William Power. And on the right is his agent, John McCormack. He's on the right, and his agent, John McCormack, is on the left. It was taken in early 1940, where again, it would appear from the photograph, the windows of the Rapide were not yet masked. But this aircraft carried an RAF roundel. When Power did not get elected, he didn't get elected, but he polled highly, perhaps unusually. But this was aided because the established UK parties, the Tories and the Liberals, had agreed not to, Labour and the Liberals in this constituency had agreed not to oppose incumbent parties in wartime elections. So it was a two-horse race. Ganderdour operated several Rapides, one of which had a particularly comfortable cabin, as he favoured this aircraft for personal use. He used to make periodic visits before the war and after over to Europe. On the 2nd of June 1936, Ganderdour operated the first scheduled service to Shetland. A bit of one-upmanship on Ted Fresson, who had developed Sumburgh Airfield and had announced that the airport would be open for services from the 3rd of June. The rivalry could be intense, with Ted Fresson regretting that he had not had obstacles placed on the airfield to prevent his rival from landing. This image shows Ganderdour's Rapide on the ground at Sumburgh, with Eric Ganderdour, the pilot Eric Starling, Ganderdour's partner Caroline Brunning, and his guest Viscount Arbuthnot. Note that they had brought their own refueling with them. They departed from Dyce at 11 AM, and 1 hour 35 minutes later, they touched down at Sumburgh and taxied up to the wooden hut that Fresson had erected for the benefit of his passengers. And this was Sumburgh's original terminal building. I mentioned a moment ago that Fresson had previously advised Ganderdour that Sumburgh would not be open to him until 3rd of June, when Highland Airways Shetland service would commence. Ganderdour had advertised the Aberdeen Airways service as starting on 2nd of June, and Fresson was ultimately caught unawares by his rival following this through. Here's how Ted Fresson recalled events. In May 1936, we advertised commencement of our Shetland run on 3rd June. A few days before that date, an advertisement appeared in the Aberdeen and Shetland press announcing the opening of a similar service by our competitors the day before we were advertised to start. I immediately wrote to Aberdeen Airways Dyce a letter pointing out that Sumburgh Airfield was not open until 3rd June and refusing them permission to land until the airfield was officially opened. Foolishly, I did not send Jim Black, our Sumburgh agent, instructions to immobilise the airfield by placing obstacles over the landing area. I don't think at that date we fully appreciated the type of forceful competition we were up against. Eric Starling, Ganderdeur's pilot, later described the incident as having been, quote, a bit naughty. One wonders how the service would have panned out if Eric Starling had made his approach to Sombara to find his landing run blocked by obstructions. Here's Starling's logbook entry for that flight. In the remarks column, he has written, inauguration flight with Viscount Arbuthnot, Mr. Rankin, Mr. GD, that's Ganderdour, Mr. Fraser, and Miss B, that's Caroline Brunning. I think the other two were, certainly one of them was from the press. And these record trips flown directly in both directions. So the aircraft was GADDE. It had obviously been tested to check the wireless was functioning properly on the 1st of June. And then it did the flight the following day. So it records here that the aircraft left at 11 o'clock in the morning. It took 1 hour and 35 minutes, and it returned at 19:30, taking 1 hour 25 minutes southbound. So it rather looks as if they've perhaps gone into Lerwick and had some kind of celebration and formal reception before they headed back. The following day, say this is Eric Starling's log, and the following day, just for interest, it shows him operating Aberdeen Airways Scion aircraft here from Dice to Dornach and back again. And on the 4th, operating a Dragon from Dice up to Thurso and on to Stromness. So it was obviously quite normal to jump from one aircraft type to another and have probably a more varied flying schedule than many pilots do today. The Rapide was key to developing direct air services between the Scottish mainland and Shetland. The DH-84 Dragon was fine for bus stop services such as Fressons, Inverness, Wick, Kirkwall, Sombara, or from Aberdeen to Thurso, Stromness and Sombara, as with Aberdeen Airways. But for longer hauls across water and with minimal navigation aids, the Rapide brought with it a greater margin of safety. The Rapide was faster than the DH-84 Dragon, and I mentioned earlier that Ted Fresson had required that the Rapide be modified with the addition of flaps for short airfield operation. This was also required by Aberdeen Airways, which likewise used short airfields and required a slow approach to effect an instant landing after crossing the airfield boundary. Starling observed that if a wingtip dropped near the ground and the pilot corrected with aileron, the extra incidence caused by the dropped aileron was enough to stall the wingtip, and the wing dropped even further. It was soon found that a jab of opposite rudder accelerated that wing, and up it came. Eric Starling's deft handling of the Rapide produced a reaction from Ganderdour. Starling described this, saying, quote, "This creeping over the boundary as near the stall as one dare worried Ganderdour, and he became a very bad backseat driver. You're too high, you're too low, you're too fast, you're too slow, and so on. I soon found a way to stop him. I bet you 5 bob that I'm just right. No money ever changed hands, but it seemed to do the trick and shut him up." Ganderdour had ambitions beyond Scotland, and on 22 May 1937, Rapide GADDE, the same aircraft that had made that flight to Sombara, along with chief pilot Eric Starling at the controls, set out from Aberdeen across the North Sea on a survey flight for an espied for scheduled service to Stavanger. The Rapide did not have the range to cross the North Sea and return to Aberdeen from the Norwegian coast should the journey have to be aborted without being able to land. Meteorological conditions aside, from Aberdeen they did not have the benefit of radio bearings. And the reason for that was that Ganderdour had actually refused to install equipment, because had he done so, he would have lost his sole proprietorship of air services, and Fresson, his competitor, would have been able to fly out of Dice. So they didn't have the benefit of radio bearings, and the best they could make do with was cross bearings from Kirkwall, where there was radio direction finding equipment. So Starling was able to gauge his progress across the North Sea, but in the absence of data on wind strength and direction, sighting land upon reaching the Norwegian coast did not mean that the risks of the journey had been conquered. Therefore, instead of aiming directly for Stavanger, heading was set for the island of Utsira, offshore from Haugesund, and using this intentional directional error method to home in on Norway's west coast, he knew that whatever land was spotted, he could then make a right turn and follow the coastline south in confidence that they would find Stavanger. If they had headed straight and they made landfall, or they couldn't see the airport, the dilemma then would have been, right, do we go left or we go right looking for it? They landed safely, and the Rapide featured in the formal opening of Stavanger Airport. Down in the bottom right, striding across the tarmac, is a rear view of Erik Ganderdour. They had left Aberdeen with fuel for a duration of 4 hours and 10 minutes, and they arrived 2 hours and 25 minutes in the air. So although everything had gone well as calculated, the flight had still involved passing a point of no return. The planned service from Aberdeen was ultimately changed in favour of Newcastle, and this was in the hope of attracting air passengers from long-established steamer services across the North Sea. But intentional directional error could not be employed for regular passenger services. And Allied Airways Ganderdour Limited, as the airline had now been renamed, they employed a 4-engined de Havilland DH-86 aircraft for this service, and this was used for the next 2 years of its operation. So if you like, it actually preceded the Rapide a little bit, the first DH-86. So it, and it is a kind of bloated Rapide, but with 4 engines giving it that extra power and range. In 1946, S.E. Veal authored a book entitled Airliners and Airways of Today, and it was published in 1947. Besides great piston airliners for transcontinental and overseas travel, the book included mini airliners such as the de Havilland Dove, the Avro 19, and the Miles Aerovan. It did not include the de Havilland Rapide. Some of the aircraft featured became iconic, some became failures, and some not yet off the drawing board seemed to come from the realm of fantasy. But in Veal's estimation, the Rapide was an aircraft of yesterday. He would surely have been amazed to know that there are still a few airworthy Rapides in 2021, 75 years after he penned his book and 87 years after the first Rapide took to the air. But of course, all good things have to come to some kind of conclusion. So what happened eventually in terms of a Rapide replacement? From the creation of BEA, Captain David Barclay, who was ex-Midland and Scottish Air Ferries, and Northern and Scottish Airways and Scottish Airways, continued to fly Rapides to the Scottish Islands, and he was also in charge of BEA's Air Ambulance Division. The air ambulance role of the Rapide was a demanding one, it being an emergency service that would take to the air in operating conditions that were deemed beyond acceptable limits for normal airline operations. In the early 1950s, Barclay presented a case to BEA for a modern aircraft that would provide a greater margin of safety over that offered by the 20-year-old wooden de Havilland Rapide biplane. His aspiration was for another de Havilland product, the twin-engine Dove, which Veal had featured in his book. Barclay later recalled his considerable pleasure when, instead, he was offered the Dove's big sister, and BEA acquired 3 de Havilland DH-114 Herons, which were mini airliners with 4 engines. The Herons came into service in 1955. One of these, GAOFY, crashed at night on Islay in 1957 on an ambulance flight, and it wasn't replaced. But the remaining 2 Herons gave stalwart service on both scheduled routes and ambulance services until 1973. And they then went on to serve in other roles, particularly with the offshore role that was developing by that time. And I think one of them ended its career in New Zealand. The Heron, however, did not represent the first attempt to replace the Rapides on BEA Scottish services. In 1947, the new corporation attempted to introduce Junkers Ju-52s, 3-engine airliners that came from Germany as war reparations. The Ju-52 had been a highly successful airliner in the 1930s, but the ones received by BEA, which it called the Jupiter class, had been mass-produced for short-term service as military transports and were not assembled with the view of them having long careers as civilian air transports. In BEA service, they were expensive to operate on island routes. They needed ground support units that did not exist on island airfields, so they had to keep their engines running during turnarounds. And they also leaked asphyxiating fumes into the cockpit, which did the flight crew no good at all. They were withdrawn from service after a matter of months, and so the BEA Rapide continued for several more years. This was until 1955 in Scotland, but right through till 1964 on BEA's routes from Penzance to the Isles of Scilly. The de Havilland Heron played its role well in Scotland for well over a decade, but by the dawn of the 1970s, BEA was considering its replacement. Loganair had acquired a short Skyvan in 1969, and it served on a short-lived service between Aberdeen and Stavanger. It could also accommodate unwieldy loads, such as an occasional road vehicle or a valuable livestock pedigree bull, but these were hardly items of high demand. Loganair's Duncan McIntosh recalled BEA consulting him about acquiring the Skyvan to replace the Herons. For the type of operations intended, McIntosh advised, don't get it. But he said they did anyway. He recalled in some bewilderment that BEA had actually ignored his advice. The Skyvans served for a couple of years until Loganair gradually took over BEA services to the likes of Campbelltown, Tiree and Barra, initially using Britten-Norman Trilanders, but eventually employing de Havilland Canada DHC-6 Twin Otters, aircraft that still operate those routes after a tenure of 5 decades. The enduring name here has been that of de Havilland, albeit the Twin Otter was from the Canadian division. Well, it seems that, with due respect to the Heron, the most enduring Rapide replacement has been the Twin Otter. Some Rapides have become museum pieces. Ganderdower waged a war of attrition to gain proper compensation for the loss of his airline and airport at Aberdeen when both were nationalised in 1946-47. In 1966, Rapide GADAH, named Pioneer, emerged from his secured hangar at Dice, where it had been parked under lock and key for nigh on 2 decades. For a number of years, this aircraft was displayed in unrestored condition at the Museum of Flight at East Fortune. And you can see it here at East Fortune on the left. If you look closely, you can maybe spot, the absence of missing rigging and so forth. You wouldn't take to the air in that condition. Eric Starling's last flight for Allied Airways was at the controls of this aircraft, and this photograph was taken when he was reunited with the aircraft at East Fortune 5 decades later. The aircraft was subsequently transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry at Manchester, where it's displayed in cosmetically restored condition. It actually looks quite smart now. 87 years since the Rapide's first flight, the type is still gracing the skies, albeit not in airline service. Some have been meticulously maintained to appear at air shows, anniversary events, and on pleasure flights. I personally had the thrill of joining a pleasure flight over Inverness many years ago. And in drawing to a close, I show you this photograph of that particular day when I was in the illustrious company of the late aviation historians Ron Davis, R.E.G. Davis, and John Stroud. And I have to say, I don't look like this anymore. So thank you very much for joining with me today. Thank you.
Well, that was a fascinating story, Iain. Now, several questions coming in, but you're coming back at 4 o'clock to take part in what's looking like being a fascinating discussion with 2 other very interesting people. So maybe we'll just pick out some now and then go into the rest more fully then. And one of the questions was, you mentioned the company de Havilland. You mentioned what happened to the Rapide. What about de Havilland? Was the Rapide at the time of their peak? Did they all go on to go further? Because the name seems to fade out eventually.
Yeah, well, they certainly went on. I'm sure there'll be people joining us today who perhaps remember holidays many years ago when they went on the de Havilland Comet. BEA operated them, and then famously Dan Air. And de Havilland were also involved with the Trident, which ultimately became the Hawker Siddeley Trident, because ultimately a lot of the UK airline manufacturing companies of aircraft were taken, within the nationalised remit. So they went through different formations. I suspect somewhere deep in the history of British aerospace, their name will crop up on several occasions. Notably, of course, some others, companies, notably Shorts, have still retained their identity into modern times, but that's another story.
It was a time, the 30s, when I guess so many people in Britain could name these aircraft manufacturers: de Havilland, Shorts, Hawker Siddeley, Handley Page, Avro. Now they all seem to have gone. We just hear of, I think, something called Airbus, and
Yes.
very little. And of course, Britten Norman, as we heard yesterday, really flying the flag very well. But so few aircraft manufacturers today.
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, take a visit to your local airport, and as you say, it will be either Airbus or Boeing. De Havilland Canada did have quite a long career, and a familiar sight until a couple of years ago would also have been Flybe's DHC-8s, which they're now trying to, I think the administrators are gradually finding new homes for those aircraft, but that was the Canadian division. There was also an Australian division, which built the Drover. But yes, the big two very much dominate it. There is Embraer from Brazil. British Airways fly their aircraft on routes out of Glasgow now to Belfast Harbour with the demise of Flybe. And it's also the linchpin to their services out of London City Airport, which is a short takeoff and landing airfield. So Embraer's another one. Britten-Norman, as you mentioned, have been a quiet success story. It was really quite incredible listening to the presentation yesterday, you know, that and very much, although the aircraft has developed over the years constantly, it's also interesting to hear it echoing the story of it's not broken, don't fix it. It's really quite incredible how the original concept is still the basis of that aircraft, and it's still developing now with an eye on green technology.
Do you think there was something maybe happened through the war that all these aircraft manufacturers really were driven to the absolute limit in terms of production, in terms of innovation, and that somehow they lost momentum, just ran out of energy, became tired after the war?
Well, there may be an element of that, but nationalisation shortly after the war, which I suppose is part of that story about so many industries running out of energy, that they'd redirected all their energy to wartime activities, and how do you make that adaptation after the war? And certainly, I think a lot of companies were aware of that after the Second World War, because if you look at shipping after the First World War, all that effort had gone into shipbuilding for the First World War, and then you went into depression in the 1920s, and famous names disappeared because there just wasn't the market. So I think post Second World War there was a consciousness that it had to be a transition, albeit through austerity in the early 1950s, to make the adaptation more comfortably without the self-harm that had happened in the 1920s. So yeah, the disappearance of some of these companies, it was part of the wider taking under state control of different aspects of aviation.
Of course, the same thing then happened with the actual airlines themselves. Before the war, Orkney had the competition you so vividly described between Gander Dower on the one hand and Captain Fresson on the other. And then suddenly, after the war, nationalisation and Orkney and the Highlands and Islands services seemed to somehow fall between the cracks. Yes,
I mean, the story of Ted Fresson and Gander Dower is an interesting one. I think they were both characters in their own right. The rivalry between them was very intense. Of course, Ted Fresson probably felt that when Gander Dower set up, he had started off with services from Aberdeen, where he had a great facility, from Aberdeen down to Edinburgh and Glasgow. So there was not perceived to be any conflict of interest between him and Ted Fresson flying out of Inverness to Orkney. But Ted Fresson had identified a niche in the market because the alternative was the steamer service, and many passengers could recount experiences of arriving at Kirkwall with green complexions and so forth. Gander Dower found that in heading south, that by contrast, he was in competition with a sophisticated and well-developed rail service. And that's why he reassessed and thought over water is the way to go. So he flew out of Aberdeen. As Ted Fresson aspired to expand his service, Ganderdour wouldn't let him fly into Dice. So Fresson had to look for another landing ground, which he got at Kintore, but not quite so handy. I think first he was at Seaton and then he was at Kintore. So yeah, there was a lot of rivalry between them. But the ultimate outcome is they both lost their airlines to nationalisation. Now, okay, Fresson's airline arguably, had been taken over by bigger outside concerns, and he was running the northern operation. But ultimately, these companies were taken over in nationalisation. And despite their previous rivalry, they suffered the same fate. And I think they became kind of friends in adversity from that period on. Fresson had to look for a new career and went off to East Africa for a time flying. Ganderdour locked up his hangar and wouldn't let the nationalised authorities for airfields and airlines in, and that's how that Rapide survived. And he held out and he held out. And I think it was really only with structural changes with the airfields ownership and also with airlines, the creation of British Airways through the combining of BEA and BOAC, that they did have to settle with them to resolve these outstanding issues before the amalgamation. So it's quite incredible to see how he held them to ransom. He was a very hard man, I think, but he wasn't letting them away with it, and they eventually had to pay out pretty substantial money to compensate him for the loss of his airline and his airfield 2 decades after he'd been forced to shut down.
How was it that the nationalisation worked out like that they really damaged air services in the north, rather than building them in or integrating them in a way that would have benefited the local services and the national ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a certain mindset for a long, long time. If you take BEA as an example, it was seen as providing a public service rather than operating on a firm financial self-sustaining footing. Now, having said that, the pre-war airlines tended to lose money hand over fist, but I think their view was, well, you've got to sow in order to reap. But the thinking in BEA didn't go along that way, and they had pretty much a monopoly. There were one or two small opportunities where private airlines managed to get routes, quite often operating on behalf of BEA under a kind of corporate agreement. But yeah, I think BEA, they hung on to things just for the sake of having them, whether they were viable or not. And if you look at the war of attrition again in the 1960s into the early 70s, where Logan Air was becoming established as a third level airline, felt it was ideally placed to operate thin routes to the likes of Tyree and Barra. BEA was very reluctant to let them go. And you saw it later on with even their heavier utilised routes that use the likes of the Viscount, Stornoway, Kirkwall, Lerwick. Yeah, there was a big reluctance to let, these were their property and to let them go. And it was only post-privatisation, when shareholders were involved in looking at the bottom line, that you did gradually start to see this withdrawal from third level routes. I mean, arguably, we commented on Airbus and Boeing seeming to dominate everything these days. The way airlines operate these days, is economies of scale. Ryanair have hundreds of Boeing 737s. EasyJet have big fleet of Airbus A319s and 20s. That makes sense. Why on earth was the nationalised corporation, particularly after it became British Airways, still hanging on to the likes of the Viscount and the Hawker Siddeley 748 going into Stornoway, while at the same time they were operating Boeing 747s around the globe? It just doesn't make sense, does it? Now.
Iain, this one question about you, with your background as a historian and your deep interest and track record with a number of books in aviation, which actually came first with you, the history branching out into the aviation, or a love of the air?
Well, I worked in the travel business for a number of years, a couple of decades. I worked for British Caledonian Airways for a while, and then I worked in the travel trade. And during that time, a company I worked for decided to open a branch in Stornoway, which had never had a travel agency before. And I remember the managing director coming in to the office one day and announcing to a manager's meeting that, oh, we've just signed a lease for an office in Stornoway. He'd been up there. And he says, now we just need to decide who's going to volunteer to go up there. And you just had to look around the assembled people and think, who do you expect? This one's got family, that one's just got married, whatever, Anyway, I fancied it. I thought about it, discussed it with my wife. So I went up to set up this office in Stornoway. Now, I did a bit of kind of article writing and stuff like that. I've been doing that for quite a while. And I've been mulling over the idea of a little book on Loganair. And I became quite friendly with an office supplies company owner who supplied a lot of our office supplies equipment and so forth, and who also did some local interest publishing in Gaelic and so forth as a sideline. And I mentioned this idea of a wee book on Loganair, and he said, yeah, great idea. He says, I'll publish it. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'll need to write it now, So that's really what kind of kicked it off. And then I drafted the book, but time went on a wee bit, and it was coming up to Loganair's 25th anniversary. And we actually delayed publication of the book because we thought, well, maybe the 25th anniversary would be the time to launch it. And that's what kind of got me into it. In doing that book, Loganair at that time had a fleet of Islander aircraft, which some of which were named after kind of pioneers of aviation. All of whom I think were deceased, except there was this guy, Eric Starling, that I knew nothing about. And I said, who's he? What did he do? And someone says, well, why don't you just go and ask him? And it turned out Eric was alive and well and the most genial chap. So he helped me a lot with that. And then in the course of that, did his story. And that's how it kind of developed. Then I had a career change later on, where I was actually looking for another job in the travel industry. The one that I was working at I felt not sustainable. And a couple of jobs I applied for, they said, yeah, you've got good experience and so forth, but we only take on graduates. And I'd not been to university, but it got me thinking, and I thought, well, maybe I should investigate this. And I did. But then I thought, if I do this, I'm not going back into the travel industry. I'm not going to do a business management degree or something. I'm going to do something that I feel I'm going to enjoy. So I ended up doing a history degree and that's what I've been doing for the last, not the degree, but history, historical investigation is what I've been doing for the last 25 years or so.
Oh,
That's
well,
a short version.
you've unearthed some wonderful material, and you tell the story in such an interesting and enjoyable way. And Iain, indeed, you'll be coming back at 4 o'clock to join us when we look further into the story of the Rapide. And you're going to be in the company of two people with close association with the aircraft. One of them is Richard Fresson, son of the legendary Highland Airways pioneer Captain
Whom I
Ted.
know well.
And the other one is David Findon, part owner of Salonia Airways Dragon Rapide GAHAG, which he flew to and from Orkney for the 2015 Aviation Festival. So very important, Iain.
I look forward to meeting him.
Stay with us, and we'll be back in an hour's time. So thank you in the meantime for this fascinating presentation of the aircraft story. Thanks to the technical team behind the scenes, and of course to everyone viewing. From us all, we'll simply say till 4 o'clock. Goodbye for now.